If you would be turning over to Romans chapter 12. So we're picking up in lesson number 4, setting the right example to follow. And I will say, as Jesse said in the very beginning of his class, I'm no expert. I can't tell you why Jesse asked me to fill in for him. I have no graduate certificate in parenting. I'm still in the midst of it myself. So this is a class that I was looking forward to. I will tell you from my perspective, as someone who is going through it, I'm really looking forward to input from those of you that have completed the process, those of you that have experiences both good and bad. I think that one of the things that we fail to do is, as Christians oftentimes, is we don't like to talk about the bad things that we've done because we have a perception of ourselves that we want to keep. But the Bible is very clear that we're all sinners. All of us are the same. We all make mistakes. And one of the ways that we can help each other grow is by being honest about those mistakes that we have made, and especially with parenting, because it is such a huge responsibility that we have as parents. And so everything that we can do to help each other out, I think, is what we need to be doing. So one of the things that, as I was looking through various notes, thinking about being an example to our children, I thought, well, what do you want your children to be? When we think long term, who do we want our children to be? And I think that if we have an answer to that question, then that should help guide us in the way that we train them, in the way that we parent them. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to obviously make mistakes along the way, but if we know who we want our children to be, then that should help us in the way that we are, the way that we act, and the way that we parent. And I hope that ultimately we want our children to be Christians and that we want them to go to heaven. And so if that's the case, then there's a particular way that we're going to have to parent. So one of the things that I know was mentioned at the beginning of class, so Jesse did provide a book for everyone, but he's not really using the book. It's just more of a reference material for everybody. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't looked at it a lot, but in preparing for this class, I actually looked at quite a bit of it. And Bonnie's uncle, Chris Reeves, has an article that is one of the lessons. These lessons are just a bunch of articles that were in Truth Magazine that have been compiled and questions added to it and put it in a book form. But one of the questions that Chris raises is, do you love your child enough to set the right example? And I think that's such a great way to phrase the question. Because we can say that we love our children, but do we really love them enough to set the right example for them in the way that we live our lives? It's one thing to say that you love somebody, but to actually do the things that are necessary to prove that love, that's a totally different thing. And our children may be young and not understanding in the fact that we're not actually showing them love. They obviously don't have a proper understanding of what love is, and sometimes love is doing the hard things with our children and also with ourselves. And so as we go through the class, think about that. Do you love your child enough to set the right example? And likewise, do you love my children enough to help me? And again, part of that is talking about our successes and the things that maybe we would do differently. So one of the first couple of questions was Proverbs 20 and verse 7. The righteous man walks in his integrity. His children are blessed after him. And we recognize that. So we're going to pick up in question number 3. So we had went over the first passage, Romans chapter 12, the first couple of verses. We're going to pick up in Romans chapter 12, verses 9 through 13. And some of the passages we may read, but we're not going to read everything just because I want to make sure that we get through the class. So whenever the final bell rings, we got to be done with lesson 4. I don't want to hinder anybody from making a comment, but we're going to try to move along. So Romans chapter 12, verses 9 through 13. Somebody just kind of summarize that for us. There may be something in particular that you took from that passage. And the question that we're looking at as we look through all of these passages is, how do the following scriptures relate to the example that we are setting for our children?
You kind of set the tone with your kids. That's kind of the same things that you're seeing here. There's all kinds of mindsets and attitudes that are here that your children will see. Even as little as Allison, 3 years old, she knows whenever Tiffany's frustrated. She ain't up here, so.
But she definitely can't tell when you're frustrated. Jeff?
The way that you live in translates verse 9, it says, don't just pretend to love others, really love them. And then it goes into all these examples of how you do that are listed in the rest of the verses.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we need to take from this passage is sincerity. Again, we can say that we love somebody, we can say that we love our brethren, we can say that we love our neighbors, but if we're not actually showing that with our character, with the attitudes that we display, then it's not really true. It's fake love, is what it is. Others, things that you took away from Romans 12, 9 through 13. So one of the things that kind of stuck out to me is in verse 11, not lagging behind in diligence. And the King James Version translates that as not slothful in business. And so when you look up that the definition of that word there, slothful or not lagging behind, it refers to those who are slow, idle, destitute of promptness of mind and activity. And you can compare it to Matthew chapter 25 and verse 6, which we have recently studied with Jesse in a lesson with the parable of the talents, and something that I had not paid very close attention to, but in verse 6, for the 5-talent man, it says, immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with him and gained 5 more talents. So he didn't wait around. He was going and doing something with his talent. And so one of the things that we know is there are many things to do within the Lord's church, but also the example that we show in the workplace and the example that we set for our children in the workplace. One of the passages that I thought of was Ecclesiastes 9 verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. There's diligence that's required with that. There was a commentary that I had read that talked about the Christian religion just in general, that it teaches the value of time. It presents numerous and important things to be done. It inclines people to be conscientious in the improvement of each moment. And it takes away the mind from those pleasures and pursuits which generate and promote indolence, which is laziness. And I think that that's a societal problem that we have, is this just laziness. And so if we want our children to manage their time properly, well, what do we need to do? If we want our children to be good managers of their time, then we need to show them how to be good managers of time. If we're not showing them how to be good managers of time, then why would we expect them to then become good managers of time? So I talked about the book, and this is one of the comments, and this is from Steve Locklear. He says, if you want them to be compassionate and show mercy to others, they must see you helping those who are in need as the opportunities arise. If you want them to be hospitable, they must see you being kind and welcoming guests. God expects you to be a doer of His word. He and your children know if you are. Are you being who you want your children to be in service to God? And so this is some of the attitudes that are shown in these passages. And so if we, again, going back to that first question that we asked, who do you want your children to be? Who do you want your child to be? Well, if we want them to be hospitable, which we're called to be as Christians, if we want them to be compassionate, which we're called to be as Christians, then we have to be displaying those things. So, and I like the comment, He and your children know. That's God. God knows and your children know. You can hide it from just about everybody else, but God knows and your children know. Just like Andy said, Allison can tell if Tiffany's aggravated or frustrated. One of the things that I had read, science shows that by age 5 or by the time your child gets to kindergarten, like most of their development has taken place in the sense of the way that they're going to act. And so that's a scary thought. That means you've got a very short period of time to really be teaching them and training them and disciplining them. All right, Romans chapter 13. What's a takeaway from Romans chapter 13? Obeying the higher authorities. Okay. Love your neighbor. Andy?
They're not talking about it so much right now, but with these defund the police that we've seen in these poorer neighborhoods in the inner cities, this passage right here, if that all these people had this in their minds and been taught this, you wouldn't be having that kind of problem.
So what do we have a general lack of? We have a general lack of respect for authority. Well, where does that come from? I mean, it comes from the parents. You don't send your child to school and they're 5 years old and they have no respect for their teacher, and it's the teacher's fault. It's because they were never trained to have respect for authority in the home. And this is such a huge problem within society. Zoe talks about a girl that's very disrespectful at school, and the teachers have had conversations with her parents, and she acts like the child's parent is perfectly okay with their actions. They have no problem with it. Just complete and utter lack of respect for authority. And so if we want our children to be respectful of authority, then we have to set that example, and we have to train them to be respectful of authority. And if you think about it, there may be certain laws or certain rules that we don't like, but we need to abide by them because our children are watching. And what happens if some particular law that maybe you don't like and you think, well, it's not really that big of a deal, and so you don't really pay attention to it, you don't heed it? What is that showing to your children? Oh, so my mom and dad can pick and choose which ones they want to follow. I can pick and choose which ones I want to follow. Well, if I can pick and choose which of the laws of the land that I want to follow, well, then why can't I just pick and choose which laws of God that I want to follow? You see, the smallest things, they lead to bigger problems. And so we have to make sure that we're paying attention to those things and being a good example in those things. Todd talked about loving your neighbor as yourself. Verse 10 says, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And that's such a huge thing when it comes to parenting, is teaching our children, again, proper love. But we need to make sure that we are teaching them respect for authorities. Ephesians chapter 5. So the next couple, I'll take a couple of comments. I think it was lesson 1. We did a whole class on husbands and wives and marriages, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these, but Ephesians 5:22 through 24, and also verse 33 with the wife being in subjection. Does somebody have a comment about this passage and the example that we might be setting for our children? Damon?
This day and age, I've noticed is the fact that there's alternative parents. You know, single parents, single dads, baby mamas is the big term going around for 20-somethings that think that they want to have a child but don't want a man. So I would say the biggest thing is just your kids have to be a husband and a wife. That may be not the norm.
Yeah, it's sad to say, but that's the truth. And I think that part of this is helping our children understand structure, and it is also helping them to understand responsibility, helping them understand that everyone is going to have a different responsibility, and this is the way God intended for it to be. The wife, the mother, has certain responsibilities that she needs to fulfill. And, you know, you can look at it from if you're a mother of all boys, or if you're a mother of all girls, you want your daughters to understand how they're supposed to act, but then you also want your sons to know what kind of wife that they should be looking for. And so it all plays a key role, both in the wife and the example that she is setting, but also with Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25, the example that the husband is setting, both as a husband and as a father, and also as the leader, as the head of the household. Especially when you're training your sons, you want them to be trained in the proper way of leading a home. And if you're training daughters, you want them to recognize what a good leader is in a home, something for them to look for in a husband. Any other comments on Ephesians chapter 5? All right, Hebrews 10, 24 through 25. And so this is obviously a very well-known passage. And so what's it dealing with here?
Saints regularly.
All right. So how does our example in this really play a part in the training of our children with the not forsaking the assembling? All right, so priorities. Drew?
We mentioned before already, kids notice inconsistencies, and inconsistency in assembly is also a lot of times a sign of other issues too from us.
All right, so children are going to recognize your inconsistencies, and I think that is just a great general point for this entire class when we're talking about our example is inconsistencies. I don't care what it's in. Obviously, this is a big one in attending our worship services and attending Bible classes, but in anything, inconsistencies, what does that do to a child? Yeah, it creates confusion. They now are trying to figure out in their minds, well, in this particular situation, my mom and dad said this and they did this, but then in this particular situation, my mom and dad said this and they did this. The two don't really compute, so now I'm confused. I don't know what's right and what's wrong. And then another situation comes up and they do something entirely different. When we don't have that consistency, then it creates this confusion where they don't know now what's right and wrong. So we have to maintain consistency in the way that we parent, recognizing that at times we're going to make mistakes and we need to be willing to admit those mistakes to our children. But we have to be consistent in the way that we train them, especially in regards to the worship services. I see another hand. Go ahead again, Drew, and then Damon.
I was just going to say, and just from my experience, consistency is also one of the hardest things about parenting. So that's where the challenge comes.
Yeah, especially when you've got a girl with that adorable face and you know what you need to do, but it's not always easy to do. Consistency is not an easy thing. Damon?
Just a way to keep consistency is, if you're a member of a certain group and they meet 3 times a week, that when your children, things come up for school, things come up for extra activities, soccer, or whatever goes on, that you let them know these 3 times are going to be for worship to God, and you can't change it. So whatever that issue that causes, if you do it ahead of time, then that helps with consistency. You don't have a big fight because they already know.
Yeah, and I think part of that goes back to being decisive in the beginning, making sure that your children, they know. As a husband and wife, you've already discussed these things, and the rules are already set before the children are ever born. You know how you're going to lead, and so when they are born and you have to start raising them, like this is the rule, this is the way that it's going to be, no questions asked. Robert?
My dad, my entire life, has said it's been years since I decided to go to church. Because years ago, he decided he would be there. This last little part of the conversation hits that on the head. We don't decide and our children see if we're making the decision. Our children know that we decided that a long time ago, and it's a part of weekly life, daily life, that we've already made the decision. There's no decision. It's when it happens, we will be there.
Yeah, I think that's a great for your dad, and that's a great point, something for all of us parents, those of you that are not parents yet, to recognize that fact. Because when you set the rule up front, then I'm assuming as you have children get older and they become teenagers, they know more than you do, and so they're going to start questioning things. But you're always going to be the same, and so eventually they're probably going to quit asking because they realize, well, this is the answer that my mom and dad are going to give. We already know this is going to happen, so that's just what we're going to do. Jeff, and then Todd.
Well, and I was going to say, and it's also okay to be the bad guy. Especially when your kids are littler, some of the stuff like Damon, well, why can't you come play soccer? But it's okay to say, well, my dad said I couldn't. That's perfectly fine.
I think too often parents want to be their children's friend as opposed to the parent, and we have to be the parent. So sometimes that means, in a sense, you are the bad guy by being the good guy. Todd?
Yeah, and just thinking about the realities, when your kids come along, you do feel this temptation to try to make this decision again, even though you've already made the good decision in the past, because suddenly it's harder. And so taking your kids to church is hard. Maybe they're making noise. Maybe you get a look from somebody else and now you're discouraged. Or maybe you feel like you're not getting anything out of services because you spend the whole time disciplining. And so you see a lot of parents make bad assembly decisions while their kids are little. And so you got to anticipate that and be resolved that we're going to see it through this difficult phase, because that's so critical that you train your children through that so that then they can reap the benefits later.
Yes, and that made me think of, I think it was Clarissa's mom that talked about when her and her brothers were small, she considered the lost years at church because she was always busy having to take care of a kid. But the truth is, you're training them in that situation. So parents that are in that situation right now, where your children can be kind of rambunctious, you're helping to train them. And so the worst thing you can do is not come because of the way that you think that they're acting and the way that other people are viewing it. So you need to continue to bring them because you are of benefit to them. Brother Ray?
That's where example comes in a lot too. You just take your kids, every time the door is open, they're going to see that. We raised 3 girls. They've all been faithful down to the now.
We talk about being examples as parents, but I use Faye and Ray as examples a lot, just with this thought of every time the doors are open. But because as they served as elders, there was never a time those doors were closed. They were never closing the doors. If people could come, then you come. The doors were always going to be open. And I think that sets an example for the congregation. It sets an example for the sheep that this is important. And so we're not closing the doors. The doors are always going to be open for us to come and to worship. Shannon?
And before COVID, Leah was old enough too to know assembling, and we talked about going down south, and she knew Alabama because we have 3 families there. And then we're back up in Oak Ridge, and then back up to Wisconsin. But anyway, so they both are okay. And then we know Wednesday we're gonna veer over here because that's our planning, So it was cool.
That's right. And so much of it is planning, and that kind of this is kind of a long reading, but I think it helps kind of summarize even some of the things that we've said. Since the Father seeks those who will worship Him in spirit and in truth, they must see in you the same enthusiasm for praising God as David had. If you want your children to worship with the saints regularly, you will be faithful to be at every Bible class, worship service, and gospel meeting you possibly can. But some parents will say, I cannot make it to all the services. Some excuses are, I have to work. As you know, God says I have to provide for my family. My family came into town, and I had to feed them. It's my only day off to have family time with the children. When we went on vacation, we couldn't find a faithful congregation. We were too busy, or we went to a denomination where our family attends. If your children hear these excuses from you as to why you cannot make it to every service, do not be surprised if they beg you to miss for a ball game, homework, studying for a test, or getting a job. They may argue that this is important for me to get a good grade, or the team is depending on me, and if I don't go, I'll have to sit in the bench. Or work on Sunday or Wednesday to pay for my car and insurance. While some are making a conscientious effort to work during services only in emergency circumstances, far too many aren't even attempting to tell their employers that they desire to have Sundays and Wednesday nights off. And I think that this is a big deal, that if you don't let this be known up front and you have children, what are you teaching your children as far as the importance of coming to worship services? We'll get Jeff, and then we're going to move on to Ephesians 4.
If you take the word right, that leading statement, setting the example to follow, as long as the mother and the father take that straightforward attitude, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Note the difference there. You may all, as parents, say, well, I'm going to set the right example in this or in that. You might as well just throw that out the window. You are setting the example. You define for your children what is normal. Period. It does not matter what you intend to set for them, because every breath you take, they're there with you. They see you. They hear you. They see it all. Yep. You set the example, whether you're making conscientious effort towards it or not. So just focus on serving the Lord and doing what is right. The example will be there for them.
That's right.
Yeah, and these excuses, I have heard almost every one of them by members of the church, and that's all they are, is excuses. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 16, it says, "From whom the whole body being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love." So how does that pertain to us and being a good example to our children? All right, so none of us have to be workers then. All right, let's move on. Again, whenever we are wanting our children, do we want our children to be workers in the church? Are we called to be workers in the church? Are we called to be active in the church? Are we called to be edifiers in the church? So, would we not want our children to be this as well? Well, if we want our children to be this, then that means we have to be that. We have to be the example for them. And so when there are opportunities to serve, do we always turn those opportunities down? Do we take the opportunities that we have to serve others? If we're not taking those opportunities, then we're not being an example to our children. Anybody? Nobody? That's a tough one, huh? All right. I'm way behind on my clicking here, ain't I? Ephesians chapter 4, 25 through 32. What do we take away from this?
Hear you tell a lie.
Don't let your children hear you tell a lie. Yes, they will. But if your children hear you tell a lie, how do you handle it? Don't lie to them. Yeah, be honest with them about the situation. So, one of the things that is kind of throughout these different passages with the husband and the wife, and even here when it talks about being angry and not sinning, don't give the devil an opportunity. So one of the questions that and this is just a question that I have, that I'm just asking right now in general, how do you best handle an argument between a husband and wife? So unless I'm in the wrong here, I don't think that there's a husband and wife that have ever existed that have never had an argument. So let's just be honest with each other. Marriage oftentimes is hard, and so you're two totally separate people. There are going to be arguments that happen, and so how do you handle those situations with your children? Is it best that you go into a closet where they can't see you, and so they never see, and they always think that their parents never have any disagreements, and then they'll grow up thinking that, well, whenever I get married, I'm going to have this? Or is it better for them to see and see you working that out? Don't make me start calling on people. Todd?
I'll give one example since my parents are out of town. So I heard my parents argue a lot, and there were times when it was probably a bad situation. But I'll tell you, so I used to go to bed and maybe the argument was still going on. But I'll tell you, as a kid, you're tuned in to that, what you can hear through the walls, right? And you're worrying about, is this going to get bad? But I'll tell you, one of the most comforting things to me was when I would hear my parents laugh. Maybe it's later when they're in bed or whatever, and they've gone to bed, and I'm still up worrying maybe, and I hear them laugh. It's like, oh, it's going to be okay. They're still friends. This isn't going to be the one that ends it, right? And so you need to let your children see that even though you're disagreeing, you're still together, and you're going to be together.
All right, Lauren? I like this. We're both kids of parents that are gone. I love it.
I think it's really important that children see their parents not only argue, but come to a resolution. So they learn how to have that conversation. A lot of the times they only see the argument and it may be over the next day, but they don't know how to solve that problem. So that's a very important missing piece that they need to have. They need to learn how to facilitate the conversation, solve the problem that's there.
All right. So teaching our children problem resolution. Robert?
Verse 32 of Ephesians 4, be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another as Christ forgave you. If our children don't see that, it's all we've talked about throughout this whole class, children are sponges. They're going to absorb that if they don't see that in our lives, and that includes our most intimate, close relationships in our homes.
I see another hand.
I think it's important also to help.
I do that too.
Sorry. I appreciate both of you.
I think it's also important to help them facilitate them also getting through arguments. I know it's easy sometimes to just shut it down, say, oh, you guys are arguing, you shouldn't be arguing. But maybe with siblings or even with you as the parent, you need to set that example of how do you get through that? How do you communicate how you're feeling? How do you communicate your feelings in that moment? And then how do you kind of work through that with somebody you're arguing with? Because I feel like a lot of times maybe we just shut it down and then they don't know how to do that as they get older. That's something I struggle with sometimes. How to get through that argument and how to really communicate how you're feeling, resolve that.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm going through this, preparing for this class, like I had to make a conscientious effort that this wasn't going to become a confession class because, I mean, I'll be honest with you, it makes me feel like I fall short a lot. And so it's very humbling to me as I'm going through some of these things and thinking about how this is going to affect my kids. And so this is one of the reasons why, even me personally, I want input from those of you that are older, those of you that have lived it, so that you can help those of us that are younger and still trying to figure it out. I recognize that yes, we do have a guidebook, but sometimes dealing with specific situations, it's nice to be able to hear from older Christians that have gone through it, and I think that's what we're told to do, to be able to lean on the older ones to help us. So let's move on to Philippians 2:14 and 15, so no complaining. Verse 14 there, do all things without grumbling or disputing. So what do we take away from this in regards to being an example to our children? What's the biggest thing that we should be showing in our lives? Contentment. I think that, that's a big one. If we're not showing contentment, then we're showing our children that, well, they should always be striving for something more or something better, and you should never be content. And that's what society teaches us. Don't ever be content with where you're at. You always need more. You need more, more, more. But we're told that we're supposed to be thankful, that we should have an attitude of gratitude, and we show that by our example oftentimes. Sean, do you have a comment? All right, so this is in the book. You can go read it. So the last one, Colossians 3:17, hold fast to Christ's authority. And I think this has to do with priorities, like Clarissa brought up in the beginning. We have to be consistent in the fact that we're going to hold to Christ's authority in everything that we do. as it says there, in word or deed, that we're going to do everything that we can, and we're going to be that example to our children in that way. All right, do you recall a time when you set the wrong example for your children in which they later imitated? If so, what happened? Let's take away the if so, because we know it happened. So what I've decided to do with this question is I want you to tell me a bad example from somebody else's kids. Oh, I bet you it's more easy to do that, isn't it? Andy, I was just kidding about that, by the way. I don't want you talking about my kids right now. Go ahead.
I was going to tell this story whenever I preach, but I'm not going to do that sermon now, so I'll tell it now. So the kids, even and especially the younger, like Allison's age, they see and catches on to everything. And so Tiffany's little house dog that I don't really enjoy. So she hears me calling her stupid, a mud, maybe even a swat at her with my foot. And then a couple days go by, and here's Allison kicking a dog. That example, Dad.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example, how children, even very, very young, they pick up on stuff like that. Jeff?
I wanted to add just a wording thing. We got to go to church, and they'll pick it instead of getting to go to church.
Right. Yeah, getting drugged to church. Norm's not up here, but obviously Norm has been very open a couple of Sundays ago about the situation with his words, and that's a big part of it. Our children are listening, and they are going to mimic us in the things that we say, and they're going to mimic us in the things that we do. A couple of things that I was looking at is admitting mistakes. So you tell your kids to admit mistakes, but then you rationalize your own. That's a horrible example. And so we have to recognize we make mistakes, and so we can't expect them to be able to take critique whenever they have made a mistake, and then we not do the same. We try to justify our actions. And I think that is such a huge problem as parents. And this is, in my opinion, a huge problem in society. We don't take criticism very well. We don't want other people telling us what we are doing that's wrong. And yet we need that, and we're told to do that as brothers and sisters in Christ. And so we can't expect our children to admit their mistakes, and then we don't. If we're not willing to confess our sins before men, why would we expect our children to do the same thing? And so I think that that's one way that we can be a poor example. Did somebody else have their hand up? Go ahead, Teresa.
Lily, even though she's 3, she can pick up on tone of voice even, and will imitate or say, well, don't be mean to such and such, and it'll make me realize, or Brad to realize, like, whoa, our tone of voice is totally uncalled for because our 3-year-old's picking up on it, but it's not okay.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily just have to be the words, but the way that you're saying the words, they can definitely pick up on. All right, so this is also in the book, so I would recommend that you go and read lessons 2 and 3 in the book, and it covers a lot of this information. So so you don't want to talk about your kids in regards to the bad things, but let's hear about your kids in regards to the good things. What are some positives that you observe in your children by setting the right example? Maybe we can use this one, and you can use some other person as an example. Shannon?
Especially around the cart at ATV in Texas, and there's kids running down the aisle, and turn down the aisle, and she's like, you shouldn't be doing that. Or one time, an old woman at Kroger in Texas was going to offer some candy, and she looked at me like, what is she doing? And so I'm like, yeah.
Stranger danger.
Much about that, sort of, but.
So with this, I don't have any specific examples for my kids, but I do have an example that is very close to me and means a lot to me, and that's my mom. So I consider my mom a very good example of someone that is very giving, very compassionate, and will do anything and everything for everybody, even if it's to her detriment. And I know that my mom is the way that she is because of my granny. And my granny was the exact same way. And so I know that my mom saw that example. And so my mom is that way, I know in part because of my granny. And so it just proves when you are setting that good example, the effect that it can have on your children, and hopefully even your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. So there are two things that I thought of in regards to things that we really need to focus on in being a good example to our children. And one of those is, in times of trouble, keep believing. We live in a very difficult society, a difficult world, but I think that as we study the Bible, all times and ages had difficulties and struggles. But the thing that we have to recognize as Christians is we have hope. And we have to be able to instill that in our children, that we always have hope. And the other one is don't quit. Because I think perseverance is key. As we're going through life and as we go through the various struggles that we have, you can't quit. You've got to keep going. And our children see that in us, and they see when we want to quit, and they see when we don't want to keep believing, and that can have an adverse effect on them. And so I think that we need to keep believing and make sure that we don't quit. Ms. Shirley?
We've been very fortunate. All of our children are faithful, and most of our grandchildren are faithful. And they never got into any trouble in school or any other place. And so that's what they're passing on to their children. And I think that sums it up for me. As many mistakes as I made raising my children, which were many, we did try to show them, you've got to go to church, you've got to do the right thing, you've got to do the right thing at school, you've got to do the right thing in other places. And they've all done that.
And I think that that's a great testament to the job that you've done, and something that I know that all of us that are younger in our parenting, something that we are looking forward to. So very quickly, I know that the last bell has rang. So why is it important for parents to teach by example? I'm just going to read a couple of things. So sometimes we are blind to our own faults and may condemn our children's behavior when we are practicing similar conduct ourselves. If you have failed to be the right role model for your child, remove the beams now so that you can properly judge your children. Many parents throughout the years have practiced the do as I say, not as I do philosophy of training their children. While they are telling them the right thing to do, in actuality, children can see through that lip service and the time become the same hypocrites that the parents train them to be. Actions speak much louder than words. There's a proverb in the Bible that says, like mother, like daughter, and that is in Ezekiel 16:44. And the same principle applies to fathers and sons. If we want our children to be good in secular endeavors, we will start them at a young age, teaching them the fundamentals, having them practice, helping them to discipline themselves, and encouraging them to be the best that they can be. Many parents in this world will spend much time, money, and effort to see their child succeed in areas where the rewards are only temporal and will cherish one day. Parents, if you want your children to be a faithful Christian and help them go to heaven, you must set the right example and teach, instruct, discipline, and correct your child with the Word of God. And then finally, for our children to become who we want them to be, which is the question that we ask at the beginning, we must be that person ourselves. Thanks, everybody. I'll make sure that Lesson 5 questions are in the back, and be prepared for that next week.